The mountains of Montana do not care who you are. January 1979. The Black Ridgeline of the Absaroka Range. Elevation 9,000 feet above sea level. Temperature -1 degree Celsius before the wind chill strips that number to something almost incomprehensible. Something that makes standard cold weather doctrine feel like a suggestion written by someone who had never actually stood on this ground. The wind here does not gust. It sustains. It arrives from the northwest carrying nothing but malice and moisture, and the particular indifference of a landscape that has been killing unprepared men since before the nation that claims it existed. The ground on the plateau holds water and ice in equal measure. The grass, yellow and matted, lies flat like something already dead. The rocks, when you can find them, are slick with a thin rime of frost beneath a film of black water. Every handhold lies. At night, this landscape becomes a different category of hostile. There is no ambient light. None. The clouds that pin themselves to the ridgeline block every star. A man lying still in that darkness, without a torch, without movement, without sound from another human being, experiences a particular kind of silence that civilian existence simply cannot manufacture. It is the silence of a world that has decided you are irrelevant. It presses against the eardrums. It enters the lungs with every breath, cold and mineral and utterly indifferent. In that darkness, in that cold, in that wind, men were moving. They had been moving for 19 hours. They would move for another 11. They carried loads that, because numbers tell the truth when narrative cannot average 36 kilograms. A weight equivalent to carrying a teenage child on your back while climbing and descending the equivalent of a 7-story building every 40 minutes. Repeatedly. Across terrain specifically selected because it offers no mercy and no shortcuts. They carried this weight wearing boots that had long since soaked through. They carried it on legs that had not properly rested in 4 days. They did not complain. This is the first thing you need to understand about them. They did not complain because they had already stopped thinking of discomfort as a category of information. It had become simply the background condition of their existence. The way gravity is a background condition. You do not complain about gravity. You move through it, or you do not move at all. What happened in these mountains over the following 18 months? What this training exchange produced? What it revealed? What it prophesied? All of it became one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the institutional history of American special operations. Uncomfortable enough that official accounts still prefer not to linger on it. Uncomfortable enough that the full picture required years of piecemeal testimony, declassified after-action reports, and the candid admissions of retired officers speaking without lawyers present. Because what these mountains proved, what the Absaroka Range and the men who moved through them in silence proved, is something that certain institutions spend enormous resources trying not to believe. They proved that you cannot buy your way to competence. You can only earn it. And the man who understood this better than anyone, the man who had staked his entire career on the belief that he could translate what these mountains demanded into an institution that would answer the call when the nation needed it most, was about to learn that understanding a truth and successfully transmitting it are two entirely different things. His name was Colonel Marcus Blackwell, and this is the story of what the mountains taught him, what he built from that teaching, what broke, and what he rebuilt from the wreckage. Colonel Marcus Blackwell stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 192 pounds in January of 1979. He was 52 years old. His hair, once dark, had gone to iron gray in the years since his 40th birthday, and he wore it regulation short, above a face that had never been called soft by anyone who had served alongside him. His eyes were pale blue, not the romantic pale blue of magazine descriptions, the pale blue of creek water running over limestone in winter. Clear and cold and capable of a stillness that made junior officers instinctively straighten their posture when they entered his field of vision. He had earned the Silver Star, in circumstances that remained partially classified. He had received 2 Purple Hearts, the second one for wounds sustained during an operation that the Department of the Army still listed only as a training exercise, a bureaucratic fiction that fooled no one who had been there. He was a former Green Beret at a time when that designation still carried the full weight of its original intent. He had served in theaters that the evening news never mentioned, and in capacities that his personnel file described with the vague language reserved for work that cannot be discussed in congressional hearings without clearing the gallery first. By every external measure, Colonel Marcus Blackwell was an exceptional soldier. But what mattered about Blackwell, what made him simultaneously the right person to build what he built, and the complicated figure at the center of this story, was not his decorations or his service record. What mattered was what had happened to him in 1962. That year, at the age of 35, already a proven operator with more operational experience than most officers, twice his seniority, Blackwell had been sent to train with Shadow Division. Even the name carried weight that most military designations do not. Not the weight of publicity or political backing. The opposite. The weight of deliberate obscurity. Shadow Division was the oldest special operations unit in the American military, and it had survived for 3 decades, not by seeking attention, but by producing results so consistent and so quietly devastating that the institutional apparatus had learned to leave it alone. Shadow was based at a facility in the Absaroka Range of Montana that did not appear on any unclassified map. The nearest town was 47 miles of unpaved road away. The facility itself was functional rather than impressive. Wooden barracks that had been built in the early 1950s, a firing range, a communications building, a medical station, a mess hall that served food designed for caloric density rather than pleasure. No compound, no shooting house with computerized target systems, no fleet of specialized vehicles. What Shadow had instead was the mountains, and the mountains had been answering the same question for 30 years. The question was simple. The answer never was. What are you made of when everything external has been removed? Blackwell arrived at Shadow Division in the spring of 1962 as a confident, decorated officer. He believed with the particular confidence of someone who has never encountered the limits of their own competence that he was ready for whatever Shadow had to offer. He was not ready. He was not ready for the selection process that began on his second day and did not end for 14 months. He was not ready for the progressive load-carrying marches through terrain that seemed designed by someone who hated the human knee. He was not ready for the isolation. Not just the physical isolation, though, that was real enough. The psychological isolation. The absolute removal of every external validation that a military career provides. No rank mattered on those mountains. No decoration, no reputation. The mountains did not read letters of recommendation. The selection pass rate at Shadow Division in 1962 hovered between 10 and 15%. Of every 100 men who began the process between 85 and 90, never finished it. They were not failures in any conventional sense. Many went on to distinguished careers in other units, but they had encountered something in those mountains, some version of themselves that they had not previously met, and that encounter had produced a verdict they could not appeal. The ones who remained, the 10%, the 12%. They were not necessarily the fastest or the strongest or the most physically gifted. They were the ones who discovered in the cold and the dark and the weight that they contained something that could not be extinguished. Blackwell was one of them. But what he remembered most vividly about that year, what he carried with him for the next 15 years like a stone in his chest, was not the moment he passed. It was the moment approximately 3 weeks into selection, standing at the base of a ridge at 4 in the morning, with 36 kilograms on his back and ice in his eyebrows, and the certain knowledge that the next checkpoint was 11 miles away across ground that would take everything he had, when he realized something that changed the entire architecture of his understanding. He realized he had been wrong about himself, not wrong about his fitness, not wrong about his skills, not wrong about his courage, which was real and had been tested and had held. Wrong about the depth of it. He had believed before Shadow that he knew who he was. Tough, capable, determined, decorated. A leader. But standing at the base of that ridge at hour 47 of a march designed to strip every story away, he discovered that the person he had believed himself to be was a surface. Beneath that surface was someone he had never met. Someone who was frightened and uncertain and very, very tired, and who genuinely did not know whether the next step was possible. That person, the one beneath the story, was the one Shadow was looking for. Because Shadow Division had learned across 30 years of operational experience in some of the most hostile environments on Earth, that the surface version of a person is not the one who shows up when the plan fails at 2 in the morning in hostile territory with no extraction coming. The one who shows up is the one underneath, and you cannot know who that person is until you have met him, and you cannot meet him until everything else has been taken away. Blackwell met that person on a ridge in Montana in 1962. The meeting was not pleasant. It was conducted in silence and darkness and physical misery, and it produced not triumph, but a quiet, exhausted recognition. Oh, there you are. He later wrote in words that would be echoed in his memoir 2 decades later, words that should have been stamped on the wall of every American Special Operations headquarters in existence. When I got to Shadow, I was a big fish in a small pond. I found out I was a minnow, a man with a silver star and 2 purple hearts calling himself a minnow. That admission was both the most important thing Blackwell ever said and the seed of everything that followed. Because Blackwell came home from Shadow Division and spent 15 years trying to build something like what he had seen, trying to create an American unit that would take the philosophy of those Montana mountains and plant it at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the institutional soil was rich with funding and political will, but had never been tested by the particular kind of truth that Shadow's selection process demanded. The result was Forge Unit, activated officially on the 19th of November, 1977, at Fort Bragg. Budget classified, but the infrastructure told the story. A purpose-built facility, known internally as the Compound. A shooting house with the most advanced target engagement systems available to any military unit in the world. Extensive communications infrastructure. Vehicles. Specialized weapons from manufacturers who did not sell to conventional forces. A support apparatus that by 1979 employed more administrative and logistics personnel than most line infantry battalions. Forge was America's answer to the Munich Olympics, to the Entebbe hijacking, to a world that had decided terrorism was a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape. It was built to be the best. It was funded to be the best. And it believed with the particular confidence of institutions that have never been truly tested that it was the best. The question, the uncomfortable, catastrophic question that Blackwell himself must have sensed in the quieter moments, was whether the result actually captured the essence of the original. Whether you could take what the mountains demanded and translate it through the machinery of the American defense establishment without losing the one thing that mattered. Whether 4 weeks of selection, however demanding, could produce the same thing that 12 to 16 months in the Montana wilderness produced. Blackwell knew somewhere beneath the institutional momentum and the budget meetings and the relentless forward motion of building something from nothing that 4 weeks was not enough. He had lived 16 months, so he knew the difference in his bones. But the system did not grant 16 months. The system granted 4 weeks and called it sufficient and moved on to the next line item. He made the compromise because the alternative was to build nothing at all. On the other side of this story stands Shadow Division. B Troop and D Troop active in this period, based at that unnamed facility in the Absaroka Range, where the soul of the unit lived not in any barracks, but in the mountains themselves, where every man who wore the gray beret had broken completely before being allowed to stand among them. Shadow operated on a budget that compared to Forge was almost embarrassing. Their facilities were functional rather than impressive. Their vehicles were a mix of fleet and borrowed. Their weapons were occasionally a generation behind. What they had instead was selection, a process that lasted months, consumed men at a rate that institutional observers found almost alarming, and produced a survivor who had been stripped of everything that was not genuine. Brigadier General Nolan Whitfield commanded Shadow Division during this period. He was 45 years old. He had served with Shadow for 20 years. He had seen action in operations that would not be declassified for another generation. His manner of speaking had been refined by those decades into something that wasted nothing. When Whitfield spoke about the exchange visits with Forge, he chose his words with the precision of a man who understood that some truths are best fed to implication. He noted that the American unit showed considerable enthusiasm. He did not note what enthusiasm without the foundation of sufficient selection tends to produce under pressure. He did not need to. The mountains had already answered that question. The exchange began formally in late 1978. Forge operators arrived at the Montana facility. Shadow operators traveled to Fort Bragg. The men from Forge brought funding equipment and the confidence of an institution that had been told repeatedly by the most senior figures in the American defense establishment that it represented the future of unconventional warfare. Shadow brought silence, patience, and the quiet knowledge of men who have been completely broken and rebuilt and are no longer frightened of either process. Among the Forge operators who made the trip to Montana was Sergeant Colton Breck, 32 years old, 6 feet 1 inch, 205 pounds of functional muscle built in the field on operations carrying loads over distances that would have ended most military careers before they properly began. His physical fitness scores were in the top 3% of the entire United States Army. His marksmanship evaluations read like a textbook on precision. His psychological profile described him as exceptionally motivated with high stress tolerance. He believed he was ready for whatever Shadow's mountains had to offer. He was about to discover the same thing Blackwell had discovered 17 years earlier. Breck later told a researcher working on a classified internal review of Forge's early operational period. His name was protected under a privacy request filed with the Department of the Army in 1995, a detail that itself tells you something about what followed. The first thing they did when we got there was take us out to the hills. No briefing, no acclimatization period, no equipment orientation. Just you are going. Here is your pack. Here is your grid reference. Start walking. He paused. I remember thinking, where are the vehicles? We always had vehicles. Another pause. That was the first problem. We always had vehicles. He did not know standing at the start line on that first morning that the vehicles were not coming, that there never had been vehicles. That the question he was asking was precisely the question the mountains had been designed to make him stop asking. The vehicles were not a transportation issue. They were a philosophy issue. They represented the assumption that somewhere behind you, someone was managing the logistics of your discomfort. That there was a limit institutionally guaranteed to how far you would have to go before someone intervened on your behalf. Shadow Division had eliminated that assumption 30 years ago. The exchange program continued through the winter of 1979 and into early spring. Joint exercises, shared tactical frameworks, weapons cross-training that produced genuine mutual respect. The Forge operators could shoot. They could move in small teams with a fluency that impressed even the most experienced Shadow veterans. Their communications procedures were technically superior. Their equipment was a generation ahead. None of this was in dispute. What emerged, though no one committed it to official language, was something harder to quantify and infinitely more important. Shadow's warrant officer, the one who would later speak to a military historian, was not offering a casual observation when he described what happened around day 3 of extended exercises. He was describing a diagnostic moment that Shadow had learned to recognize across 30 years. Day 3 was the point at which the human body's initial reserves of adrenaline and willpower begin to exhaust themselves. For the first 48 hours of sustained stress, almost any well-trained operator can perform. The body has reserves. The mind has stories it tells itself. I can do this. This will end. Day 3 is when the stories stop working, when the body begins sending signals that cannot be overridden by narrative, signals that bypass the thinking mind entirely and speak directly to the older, deeper structures, the ones that existed before language, before motivation. Those structures have one message: stop. What happens after that message arrives is the only thing that matters in special operations. And the empirical answer observed across multiple joint exercises was that some of the Forge operators had never received that message before. Their selection process had not taken them there. 4 weeks cannot take you there. 4 weeks can bring you to the border. It can show you the territory from a distance, but it cannot walk you through it deeply enough or repeatedly enough to transform a single encounter with your own limits into a permanent relationship with them. The Shadow warrant officer offered a characteristically compact assessment. They were good men, good skills, but some of them had never really been uncomfortable before. Not properly uncomfortable. You could see it in their eyes around day 3. Some of them had never met that version of themselves before. Blackwell watched the exchange from a position that was both operationally close and personally agonizing. He had designed Forge's selection. He had modeled it as closely as institutional reality would allow on what he had experienced at Shadow. He had fought for the standards. He had built within the constraints of budget cycles and congressional oversight and the relentless institutional preference for speed over depth, the best approximation he could manage. And now, he was watching the gap appear. Not in every operator, not uniformly, but in enough of them with enough consistency that it could not be attributed to individual variance. It was a systemic signature, the signature of a training pipeline that had not yet fully internalized what those mountains had spent 30 years teaching. And then, Sergeant Colton Breck gave that gap a voice. It happened in a briefing room at the Montana facility. The room was spare. Wooden walls. A single overhead light. The smell of damp wool and boot leather. Breck had just completed a training cycle that had not gone as planned. He was being debriefed by a Shadow officer who maintained the courtesy of not making direct comparisons. At the end of the debrief, in the silence that follows the official portion of any military assessment, Breck said 5 words. He said them quietly, without self-pity, without drama, with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who has just encountered a truth he cannot rearrange into something more comfortable. They made us look pathetic. The shadow officer did not respond. He simply nodded, a single small motion of the head that acknowledged the statement without agreeing or disagreeing. The nod of a man who has heard this particular truth before and understands that it needs no elaboration. Blackwell heard about those 5 words through the informal channels that carry information faster than any official reporting system. He understood them in a way that no one else in Forge's chain of command could have understood them, because he had felt the same thing 17 years earlier, standing in the same mountains, discovering the same gap between belief and reality. The difference was that Blackwell's discovery had been personal. Breck's was institutional. He was not saying that he individually had been found wanting. He was saying that the system that had produced him, the system that Blackwell had built, had not prepared him for what Shadow's mountains demanded. Those 5 words landed on Blackwell with the weight that had nothing to do with kilograms and everything to do with 15 years of compromise. 15 years of knowing what was necessary and building what was possible and telling himself that possible was close enough. The mountains had just told him it was not. But before Blackwell could fully process what the mountains were saying, before he could begin the work of interrogating his own creation, the world provided a test that would make the training exchange look like a footnote. April 24, 1980. The desert. Operation Desert Lance. The mission was to rescue 53 American hostages held at the United States Embassy compound in a hostile foreign capital. It was by every measure of operational complexity one of the most ambitious counterterrorism operations ever attempted. The plan required 8 Navy RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters to fly from a carrier in the Gulf, low level through hostile airspace, to a desert staging area codenamed Outpost 1 approximately 200 miles southeast of the target city. There, Forge Unit 93 operators under the operational command of the Joint Task Force would link up with the helicopters refuel from 6 C-130 tanker aircraft already waiting at the site and proceed to a second staging area for the following night's assault. The planners had estimated a minimum of 6 operational helicopters to proceed. The mathematics left no margin. Blackwell was on the ground at Outpost 1, 52 years old, standing in a foreign desert with 93 operators around him and the entire weight of 7 months of planning behind him and the eyes of a political establishment watching from Washington. He had not slept in 31 hours. He had spent 4 months in planning sessions that consumed every waking moment. He had reviewed every contingency, every abort criterion, every possible failure mode. He had not reviewed the one that mattered, a haboob, a wall of suspended dust. Not a storm in the conventional sense, but a phenomenon that the mission weather briefers had identified as a low-probability event. 1 in 10. They had not sufficiently weighted it in the mission calculus. It reached down from altitude and turned visibility to near zero. Helicopter 6 turned back. Navigation instrument failure. Helicopter 5 turned back shortly after. Hydraulic problems. Those 2 losses reduced the available fleet to 6. Exactly the minimum threshold. 6 was not 6 with margin. 6 was 6 with none. Major General Dwight Kessler, age 56, commanding the Joint Task Force from an airborne command post, learned of the losses in real time. 23 years of military service, a decorated veteran of Korea and multiple classified operations. A man selected specifically for his capacity for operational judgment under pressure. In the cramped red-lit interior of that aircraft, Kessler had a decision to make. The calculus said 6 was the minimum. He had 6. He was advised to proceed. What he did not yet know was that Helicopter 2 had a hairline crack in the rotor blade assembly. Not immediately fatal. Not immediately visible. But present. The kind of flaw that waits for the worst possible moment to announce itself, because mechanical failure, like the mountains, does not care about your schedule. The helicopters arrived at Outpost 1 between 30 and 90 minutes behind schedule. Refueling began. The dust lingered, coating equipment, reducing visibility, irritating the lungs of every man on the ground. For approximately 45 minutes, it appeared the mission might survive its opening complications. Then, Helicopter 2 landed, and the crew reported the hydraulic failure that had been developing throughout transit. The aircraft was grounded. 5 operational helicopters, below threshold. The mission was over. Blackwell stood in the dust and the darkness with his men around him, and made the recommendation that the abort criteria required him to make. He recommended abort. Kessler concurred. The order was transmitted. What happened in the next 6 minutes was not the result of enemy action. It was not hostile fire. It was not even strictly speaking the equipment failures that had brought the mission to this point. It was the result of the most dangerous force in any high-stakes military operation, the accumulated pressure of men trying to untangle a situation that had stopped following the plan. Helicopter 3, repositioning in darkness and dust to clear the refueling area, struck the wing of a C-130 tanker. The rotor blades contacted the fuselage. The fuel-laden tanker ignited. The fireball was visible from miles away. 5 crew members aboard the C-130 and 3 Marines aboard the helicopter were killed instantly. The desert became a column of orange fire, rising into the night, consuming not just metal and fuel, but the entire premise of the operation. 93 operators suddenly managing a burning crash site in a foreign desert, loading casualties onto surviving aircraft, destroying sensitive equipment and documents. Doing all of this knowing the fires were broadcasting their location to every military installation within 100 miles. They got out. Not cleanly, not intact, but they got out. They left behind 8 dead, 6 helicopters, classified documents and communication plans, and most devastatingly photographs of American agents inside the target country who were now compromised, endangered, and in several cases never seen again. 8 dead. The operational damage behind that number was exponentially worse, and embedded in the disaster was a secondary truth harder to discuss than the operational failures, because it involved not what went wrong, but what was deliberately prevented from going right. Before the mission launched, Shadow Division had known about Desert Lance. Not the classified details, but the broad parameters. Through the channels available to special operations communities, the Shadow had been aware that Forge was planning a hostage rescue of considerable ambition, and Shadow had offered assistance. Brigadier General Nolan Whitfield had personally ensured that the offer reached the appropriate level of command. Not a public offer. A quiet professional communication saying, "We have institutional knowledge that may be relevant and we are available." The offer was considered. Routed through the chain of command, it arrived at a level where the political calculus was clear. A hostage rescue mounted with Shadow's assistance would look to a domestic audience still raw from months of television coverage of blindfolded Americans like the nation's newest counterterrorism unit could not handle its own problems. The administration was 14 months from an election. The optics of calling in Shadow were deemed unacceptable. The offer was declined with diplomatic grace. This is the betrayal at the center of this story. Not one man's bad decision. A systemic choice made at the intersection of operational planning and political self-consciousness that substituted image management for honest assessment. Shadow had spent 30 years learning what happens when a mission is designed for what it looks like, rather than for what it needs to be. They had learned it with casualties of their own. They had tried to share what they knew. The system said, "Thank you, we will take it from here." Blackwell did not learn about Shadow's offer until after the desert, after the fire and the 8 dead and the congressional investigation. When he learned, he was silent for a very long time. The silence of a man calculating the distance between the mission he had been given and the mission he might have had. The silence of a builder understanding that some of the bricks had been removed before construction was complete. Not by the desert, not by the weather, by the system he had served his entire adult life. In the aftermath of Outpost 1, with 8 flag-draped coffins and a propaganda apparatus working 24 hours a day to maximize the humiliation, Shadow Division said nothing. They did not say, "We told you." They did not say, "You should have listened." They said nothing, because saying nothing was both the professional thing to do and in its silence more devastating than any words could have been. 17 days later, Shadow answered a different call. A terrorist cell affiliated with the Foreign Revolutionary Front had seized a government building in Washington, D.C. 6 armed men, 26 hostages. Demands that were politically impossible to meet. Shadow had been on standby since hour 3 of the siege. Whitfield had deployed B Troop to a staging area within walking distance of the target building on the first evening, a decision he made without waiting for authorization, because Nolan Whitfield had spent 20 years learning that authorization arrives after the moment it is needed, and the only thing that arrives on time is preparation. The assault plan was built in 48 hours, refined over the next 72. Rehearsed in a replica structure constructed from architectural blueprints obtained through channels that the after-action report described only as interagency coordination. At 14 minutes past noon on a Tuesday in May 1980, the order was given. Operation Iron Gate lasted 11 minutes and 17 seconds. The entry teams came through second and third floor windows simultaneously. Explosive charges on first floor doors detonated 0.4 of a second later. The timing was precise to a tolerance that reflected thousands of hours of rehearsal conducted by men who had been broken in the mountains and rebuilt into something that most military professionals would spend entire careers never witnessing. 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. The 6th was captured alive, having dropped his weapon in the first 3 seconds. 26 hostages survived, 25 uninjured. 1 had been wounded by the terrorists before the assault, a gunshot to the shoulder. He survived and was released from the hospital 11 days later. Shadow Division suffered 0 casualties. The operation was filmed from the street by television cameras covering the siege. Black-clad figures moving with speed and precision the American public had never seen. Controlled explosions shattered glass methodical clearance. The footage aired on every major network within the hour and was replayed for days. 11 minutes, 26 survivors, 0 shadow casualties. The contrast with Desert Lance required no editorial comment. The calendar provided it. 17 days earlier, 8 men had died in a burning helicopter in a foreign desert in an operation 18 months in planning, executed by the most expensive counterterrorism unit the nation had ever built. 17 days later, Shadow had resolved an international terrorist incident in 11 minutes. Same country, same military, same defense budget, same political leadership. 2 operations, 2 outcomes. What was different was not equipment or weapons or communications technology. What was different was what had been built inside the men who carried those weapons. What was different was the mountains. What was different was 12 to 16 months against 4 weeks. The official investigation was convened within weeks, chaired by a retired admiral with a reputation for thoroughness. The report ran to 170 pages. Its classified annexes have still not been fully released. The language was careful. It cited command and control deficiencies, inadequate joint training, weather forecast limitations. It used the word suboptimal to describe decisions that had gotten 8 men killed and compromised an unknown number of intelligence assets. Suboptimal. 8 men dead in a burning helicopter. Suboptimal. But the classified annex contained something the public version did not. A recommendation sourced to a senior officer whose name remains redacted that proposed extended duration isolation training modeled on Shadow Division's selection process as a mandatory component of Forge preparation for future operations. The recommendation specifically cited the cancellation of extended duration isolation exercises from Forge's final pre-deployment training. Those exercises, multi-day unsupported navigation operations in demanding terrain, had been cut from the schedule in November 1979 to allow more time for mission-specific rehearsal. The decision had been logical within its own frame. There were only so many training hours. The mission was complex. Something had to give. What gave was the mountains. What gave was the thing that could not be rehearsed in a shooting house or practiced on a sand table. The thing that could only be built by walking into the dark with weight on your back and no one coming to help and no indication of when it would end. Shadow had never made that trade-off because Shadow had never had the luxury of believing the plan would hold. The mountains had taught them that plans are what you have before reality arrives. What you have after reality arrives is whatever you built into yourself during the time you spent being genuinely uncomfortable. Blackwell himself, to his enduring credit, did not hide from the truth. In his memoir published in 1983, he wrote with a directness that must have made the Department of the Army deeply uncomfortable. We did not have enough time. Not enough time to train together. Not enough time to know each other in the dark. Not enough time to find out who we really were when everything went wrong. He had spent a year with Shadow. He understood what that time had done to him. He understood, looking back at the desert, that the men he had taken there had not had that year, could not have had it. The institutional machinery did not allow for it. The budget cycle did not account for it. But the mountains do not care about institutional machinery. They do not grant extensions. Whitfield, asked years later whether the outcome at Outpost 1 might have been different with Shadow involvement, paused for a long moment before answering. Those who knew him understood that the pause contained the actual answer. What he said aloud was different. Operations produced different results for many reasons. 6 words that contained everything and committed to nothing. A masterclass in understatement from a man who had spent a career making understatement carry the weight of unspeakable things. And so Blackwell did what the desert demanded, what the 8 dead required, what the mountains had been waiting for since the first forge operator asked where the vehicles were. He rebuilt. The forge curriculum revision of 1981 was not announced with a press conference. It was not accompanied by a budget increase or a new facility. It was announced with the kind of silence that Blackwell had learned from Shadow. The revision extended selection significantly. It incorporated extended duration navigation exercises in the Appalachian Range. Multi-day isolation. Operations conducted without resupply, without communication, without the implicit promise that extraction was coming. The revision did not replicate Shadow's 16-month process. The institution still would not permit that. But it incorporated the principle that Blackwell had learned at 35 and had spent 2 decades trying to translate, and had finally, at the cost of 8 lives and a career's worth of certainty, understood could not be abbreviated. You cannot meet yourself in 4 weeks. You can catch a glimpse. You can see the outline, but you cannot sit with that deeper version of yourself long enough to stop being afraid of him. That requires months. That requires sustained discomfort that institutions resist because it is expensive and slow and produces results that cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. The first graduates of the revised selection completed training in 1982. They were different from their predecessors, not in any way a fitness report could capture, not in marksmanship or communications proficiency or tactical awareness, all of which had always been excellent. They were different in the way they carried silence, different in how they responded to the moment when the plan stopped working. They had met themselves in the dark. They had done it repeatedly and for long enough that the stranger beneath the surface had become familiar. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but known. Blackwell watched those first graduates and recognized in them something he had seen only once before, in the operators of Shadow Division, the quiet of men who have nothing left to prove. But the institutional record of this transformation was deliberately incomplete. When the revised selection produced its first graduates, the connection to Shadow Division was not mentioned in the internal documentation. The after-action reviews of the new training pipeline made no reference to the exchange program of 1978 and 1979. The classified annex recommendation that had driven the revision was not cited. It was not mentioned because mentioning it would have required acknowledging that the most expensive counterterrorism unit in American history had needed to learn its most important lesson from a unit operating on a fraction of its budget in facilities that would have been considered inadequate by any institutional standard, with equipment a generation behind. The shadow operators who had watched during those exchange visits, who had quietly noted what they observed, and returned to Montana and continued doing exactly what they had always done, received no recognition. They were not invited to congressional hearings, not cited in official postmortems, not thanked in any document that has been declassified or ceremony that has been recorded. They did not expect to be. Shadow did not operate on the currency of recognition. It operated on the currency of competence. And competence does not require acknowledgement. It requires only the mountains. Blackwell served 7 more years after the revision. He retired in 1988 at the rank of colonel. His memoir remained the most honest public accounting of Forge's early failures, until several of his operators began speaking decades later in interviews they gave only after the men they had served alongside were beyond the reach of institutional consequence. On the morning of his last day in uniform, Blackwell drove alone to a trailhead in the Appalachian Range, where Forge now conducted its extended selection exercises. He did not hike. He did not carry a pack. He stood at the edge of the tree line in the early light and looked at the ridge where the newest class of Forge candidates was somewhere above, carrying weight through cold that they had not yet learned to stop noticing. He stood there for 40 minutes. Then he got back in his car and drove to Fort Bragg and turned in his identification and signed the papers and became a civilian for the first time since he was 22 years old. He never spoke publicly about that morning at the trailhead. A colleague who knew him well enough to ask what he had been doing there received only a brief answer. Listening. One word. Delivered in the manner of a man who had learned from Whitfield and from Shadow and from the mountains themselves that the most important things do not require elaboration. The mountains of Montana are still there. The wind still blows from the northwest. The ground still holds water and ice. The darkness still presses against the eardrums of anyone who stands in it long enough to hear what it is saying. And somewhere in those mountains, or in mountains like them, men are still walking, still carrying weight, still discovering at hour 30 or hour 40 or in the frozen silence of a night that seems to have no end, that the person they believe themselves to be is not the person they actually are. The mountains know this. The mountains have always known this. They are patient, and patient things outlast everything that is not genuinely built to last. Technology fails. Budgets expire. Plans collapse the moment they meet reality. Political calculations shift with every election cycle. But somewhere on a ridge in the dark, a man is deciding whether to take one more step. And that decision made in silence, without audience, without recognition, without any guarantee that it matters, is the only thing that has ever separated the men who are ready from the men who merely believe they are. Blackwell learned this at 35. He proved it at 52. And the mountains, which had known the answer long before he arrived, and would go on knowing it long after he was gone, continued to wait for the next man willing to ask the question.